She begged for death. But death sent her something worse. Someone who refused to let her die. The stone beneath Ilara's knees was cold enough to burn, not that she felt it anymore. 3 months in the dungeon had turned her body into a ghost that still remembered sensation but no longer believed in it. Her hands, calloused from scrubbing the castle's upper chambers, had become something else down here. Something that simply endured. The iron bars casting their geometry of shadow across her face were the only calendar she had. Morning light meant she'd survived another night. There would be no morning light today. Lord Ashford's men had come at dawn with the usual cruelty masked as routine. They'd dragged her from the kitchens before the bread had finished rising, before she'd had time to understand why. Later, she'd overheard them gambling in the corridor outside. She'd been sold, traded, the details blurred into the familiar hum of her own insignificance. 28 years of existence had taught Ilara a single brutal lesson. She was debt, unpaid labor, a body that consumed bread and oxygen without ever generating sufficient value to justify either. Her mother had sold her at 14 to pay rent. The household that followed had kept her until she'd become less useful than the cost of feeding her. Now Ashford had liquidated her entirely, converting her into currency for some unknown transaction. The dungeon smelled of iron and ancient stone, of things that had rotted here long enough to become part of the architecture. Ilara's dress, once cream-colored, now the shade of old parchment stained with things she preferred not to identify, clung to her ribs. She'd stopped counting her breaths weeks ago. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness beyond her cell. A sound like a clock made of suffering. She focused on it. Let it become her only prayer. One drop, then another, then another. Proof that time still moved. Proof that she hadn't crystallized into this moment forever. A sound came then that broke the liturgy of dripping water. Footsteps. But not the shuffling of the drunk guard, not the quick clip of Lord Ashford's impatience. These steps resonated with something else, something that made the torches flicker despite the absence of wind. Ilara didn't lift her head. Hope had the texture of broken glass. Better to keep it away from her throat. The footsteps stopped before her cell. She could feel the weight of presence, the displacement of air that came with something powerful entering a space. Through the tangled veil of her dark hair, she saw boots, expensive, blood-stained, impossibly clean despite the blood. And then, a hand, long-fingered, pale as the underside of dead things. How long? The voice was low, accented with something European and older than accents should be. It asked the question the way someone might inquire about weather, casual, distant, yet somehow containing all the catastrophe in the world. Ilara didn't answer. Questions from men were traps. The hand moved to a pocket. She heard the scrape of metal. Her muscles tensed toward flight, but there was nowhere to fly. The bars of her cell became walls of a smaller prison, then smaller still, until she was nothing but a point of fear compressed into human shape. The key entered the lock. It was iron, old enough that its oxidation had become art. The lock had been sealed so long that it screamed when the key turned. Ilara watched the mechanism yield, watched the mechanism betray every promise the imprisonment had made about permanence. The door swung open. "My name is Kale," the man said. His shadow fell across her like an eclipse. "I've purchased your contract. You are no longer the property of Lord Ashford." He extended his pale hand into the darkness of the cell. Ilara's eyes traveled from his boots to his face. She wished she hadn't looked. Men had faces made of rules she'd learned to obey: desire, anger, indifference. This man's face was made of something else: sorrow that had aged into the stone of his features. Eyes that held centuries the way a well holds water. Deep, dark, reflecting nothing back. She didn't take his hand. "If you remain here," he said, I cannot protect you from what comes next. If you leave, I cannot promise you will want to survive it." The choice crystallized between them like ice forming on still water. Ilara rose to her feet. Her legs remembered how, though they'd nearly forgotten. She stepped into the threshold of the cell, into the space between the dungeon and whatever waited beyond it. She did not take his hand, but she followed him into the corridor where torches burned with flames that seemed to know her name. Behind them, the iron door swung shut and locked again, as if the cell had never released its prisoner at all. The castle was not a place. It was a breathing thing, with stone lungs and corridors that exhaled centuries. Kyle led her through passages she'd scrubbed as a servant, but never truly seen. The difference was profound. Servants saw floor level, the dust, the scuff marks, the evidence of traffic and time. Now, walking behind the pale man, Ilara saw the castle as it saw itself. Vaulted ceilings lost in shadow, tapestries depicting hunts where the prey seemed to hunt the hunters, mirrors that reflected the walls but never the faces of those who passed them. The torches followed Kale's path. She realized, after the third corridor, that they weren't burning brighter. He was somehow drawing the light closer, the way gravity draws all things toward the inevitable center. "You worked here," he said, not a question. "For 2 years," Ilara answered. Her voice was rust and disuse. She cleared her throat, hating the weakness of it. "Before Lord Ashford decided I was a liability. Did he hurt you?" The question contained no judgment, no salacious curiosity. It was clinical. It was kind in a way that made her feel like screaming. "He was thorough," she said, "but never original." Kyle made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been sorrow. At the end of a particularly long corridor, he stopped before a door of dark wood bound with silver hinges. The metal was engraved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to shift between languages, between meanings. He withdrew the same iron key and unlocked it. Beyond was a chamber that unmade the dungeon retroactively. High ceilings arched upward into darkness that felt intentional rather than infinite. A fireplace dominated one wall, flames within it burning with colors that didn't exist in nature. Deep ambers bleeding into greens, purples that seemed to contain their own light. A bed, four-posted and canopied in damask, the color of old wine. Books. Everywhere, books stacked on tables, shelved in alcoves, creating the impression that this room was made of stories more than stone. There were no windows, but somehow the room contained light, the kind of light that understood loneliness. "This was Catherine's room," Kyle said. He was looking at the tapestry above the bed, a hunt scene in which a woman was simultaneously the hunter and the hunted. She was the last to live here. "What happened to her?" Ilara asked. "She chose death," he said simply, "when she understood what loving me would cost." The honesty was like a knife across her palms. Ilara had learned to expect men to lie, to layer their truths in shadow and implication. But this man was offering his catastrophe like a gift she hadn't asked for. "I haven't brought you here to hurt you," Kyle continued. His eyes, when they met hers, were the color of old wine and older sorrow. "I've brought you here because I've discovered that isolation is not penance. It's simply prolonged execution." "Why?" Ilara moved to the fireplace. The warmth was shocking. She'd forgotten what heat felt like on skin. "Why would an immortal need a servant?" "I don't," he said. "I need a reason not to die. The distinction is subtle, but it matters." She turned to face him. In the firelight, his features were carved from marble and compassion. He was beautiful in the way cathedrals are beautiful, something built to inspire awe and a peculiar kind of terror. "What's the price?" she asked. "There's always a price." Kyle moved to the window that wasn't a window, the dark section of wall where the room seemed to end but continued somehow in the viewer's mind. He placed his palm against the stone. "Your blood sustains me," he said. "But not in the way you're imagining. Not consumption, exchange. I will feed on you, yes, but in return, I will bleed for you. I will die for you each time you need it. I will resurrect for you. The debt is permanent, the covenant sacred, and the ending." He paused. "The ending is written in blood and choice." Ilara's heart was beating in her throat now. She'd been sold to slavery her entire life. This man was offering something that looked like freedom, but tasted like a trap with teeth. "And if I refuse, then I'll return you to the dungeon," he said quietly. "And I'll finally succeed in dying." The choice balanced between them like a blade on its edge. Outside the room, beyond the stone walls and the immortal and the impossible, the castle waited. The world waited. Somewhere, Lord Ashford waited to reclaim her, or to destroy her, or to forget she'd ever existed at all. Ilara approached Chaol. She took his hand, the first voluntary touch she'd offered to any living thing in months. His skin was cold. It was also real. "Then I choose to keep you alive," she said. She didn't know yet that she'd chosen her own death. But the castle did. The castle always knew. The first feeding happened at midnight. Kyle prepared the chamber with ceremony, candles positioned at the cardinal points, each flame burning with that impossible fire that contained colors without names. He wore black velvet that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, making his pale features seem to float in a darkness of his own making. Ilara wore Catherine's nightgown, white linen, thin enough to reveal the geography of her own fragility. She was terrified. But beneath the terror was something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the final rebellion of someone who has nothing left to lose. "The pain will be minimal," Kyle said. They stood before the fireplace, which had died to embers and contemplation. "But the sensation will be like nothing you've experienced." "Will it kill me?" she asked. "No." He moved closer. His shadow seemed to have substance, texture, weight. "It will make you more alive than you've ever been." He tilted her head gently, exposing her throat. His fingers traced the line of her pulse. There, like learning a code that would unlock her from the inside out. His teeth were not what she'd expected. They were white, perfect, human-seeming until the moment they weren't. When he opened his mouth, she saw what he truly was: predator and priest, monster and mercy. Something that had learned to live with what it was by accepting that it couldn't be anything else. The bite was a rupture. It was fire and ice, death and awakening, all happening simultaneously in her neck. Ilara gasped, a sound that started as fear and transformed into something transcendent. Her blood left her body and became him. She felt it travel, felt him consume her very essence and somehow make it beautiful. When he withdrew, she was bleeding but not wounded. The marks on her throat were fading already, not healing, something else, becoming invisible, becoming real only to those who knew how to see them. "How do you feel?" Kyle asked. He was breathing heavily, his eyes luminous with something between sated hunger and renewed anguish. "Like I'm remembering how to be alive," Ilara whispered. He led her to the bed then, not with seduction, but with devotion. He lay beside her, fully clothed, and held her while her body processed the transformation. Her blood had become currency for something larger. She could feel it in her cells, in her neurons, in the places where consciousness touched the edge of understanding. "Tell me something," she said into the darkness. "Why did you let Catherine die?" Kyle was silent for a long moment. His hand rested on her waist, proprietary but not cruel. "I loved her," he said finally. "I offered her what I'm offering you, immortality in exchange for blood." She accepted, but after 50 years, she realized that watching everyone she'd ever known turn to dust while she remained. It was a cruelty I hadn't anticipated. She asked me to let her go. And you did? I killed her myself, he said, with more mercy than I've ever killed anything. We stood at sunrise and I held her while the sun burned her beautiful. She chose to burn rather than endure eternity. Alara absorbed this. It was a confession and a warning wrapped in the same story. I'm not Catherine, she said. No, Cale agreed. You're someone who's already died 1,000 times and refused to acknowledge it. That makes you dangerous. To you? To my purpose, he corrected. I wanted penance through isolation. You're going to demand penance through connection. That's far worse. They lay in silence as the fire died to nothing. Alara felt the boundaries of her body becoming permeable, felt herself existing in two states simultaneously, the servant she'd been and the vessel she was becoming. Somewhere between those identities, she found a third thing, the person she might become if she survived. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel and at what moments of the night they find you. Weeks passed in a rhythm that resembled a life. During the day, Kyle withdrew into the bowels of the castle, into chambers Alara wasn't permitted to enter. Not yet, he said. The word yet contained a promise or a threat. She couldn't decide which. She explored the library, devouring books in languages she half understood, finding in their pages the education that had been denied to her as a servant. She learned that immortals were not myths, but mathematics. Vampires were entropy slowed to deliberate pace, creatures who'd found a way to fold time back on itself and refuse the single arrow of mortality. They weren't undead. They were radically alive, experiencing decades as mortals experienced hours. She learned that Kyle had been born in 1683 in Prague to a family of scholars. He'd become a physician before the hunger found him. He'd tried to cure himself until he realized the hunger wasn't disease. It was destiny. By then, he'd killed 17 people before understanding how to feed without killing. The realization had nearly destroyed him. He'd spent the next century and a half trying to atone for those 17 deaths, accumulating penance like some men accumulated wealth. Why tell me this? Alara asked one evening. They were in the library, and she'd discovered his journals, centuries of handwriting that tracked his descent into solitude and his slow, methodical attempt to resurrect his own humanity. Cale was reading opposite her, a book in Latin open before him, though she'd begun to suspect he wasn't actually reading, but simply allowing the text to exist in his field of vision, while he processed something else entirely. Because you'll be here long enough to know it, he said, whether you realize it yet or not. I'm still mortal, Alara said. For now, he agreed. But the feeding has begun to change you. Did you notice you no longer sleep? She hadn't, actually. She'd simply stopped being tired. Her body had become a different instrument, tuned to frequencies she was still learning to hear. How long until I... She couldn't finish the sentence. Until you become like me? 3 years, maybe 5. The timeline depends on how much of my blood you accept, how often we feed, and whether you decide you want to survive the transformation. Alara set down her book. And Catherine? How long did she have? She was half changed when she asked me to end it, Cale said. 50 years in, and the hunger for humanity hadn't left her. She was caught between states, never fully one thing or the other. It was exquisite torture. Is that what's happening to me? No. He set down his own book and crossed to her. In the lamplight, he seemed almost human. The illusion holding until he moved with that impossible fluidity, that grace that belonged to nothing living. You're transforming differently. Catherine wanted to retain her mortality. You're already accepting the possibility of transcendence. He took her hand. His skin was still cold, but to her now, That coldness was the most honest thing she'd ever felt. "There are others," he said. "Other immortals. Some kind, most not. When they learn about you, they'll want to test you, seduce you, break you. The castle has protections, but they're not absolute." "Then why keep me?" Alara asked. "Why not let me live as far from your world as possible?" "Because," Chaol said, "I've spent 400 years running from connection, and I've never once managed to outrun despair. You're the first person I've met who understands that some prisons are made of safety rather than bars." He kissed her then. Not seductively, but tenderly, the way he might have kissed Catherine before he ended her, the way he might have kissed his reflection if mirrors could kiss back. Alara tasted blood and antiquity, and a sorrow so old it had become beautiful. The knock on the castle's outer door came on a night that smelled of snow and distant thunder. Alara was in the library when Chaol's posture changed, a subtle shift in the planes of his face, a hardening of something that had softened over the weeks of her residency. He stood without moving from his chair, yet somehow the room contracted around him. "Don't leave this chamber," he said, not unkindly, but absolute. "What is it?" she asked. "Reminder," he said simply, "that I'm not the only predator who walks at night." She heard the doors open, 3 flights down and through corridors, but the castle was its own instrument, and every sound traveled through its stone like blood through veins. There were voices. Kyle's low and measured, another's higher, female, carrying the texture of old amusement and older cruelty. Alara waited, pretending to read the same page of a book she'd been staring at unseeing for the past 10 minutes. The visitor stayed for an hour. When she heard the door close again, she counted another 100 heartbeats before leaving the library. Chaol was in the courtyard, standing in snow that hadn't fallen through any natural progression of weather. It had simply decided to exist here, accumulating around his boots, not melting. "Viviana," Alara said. She didn't know how she knew the name. It simply arrived in her consciousness like a truth that had always been there. "You can sense her?" Kyle turned to her with something like alarm. "The change is happening faster than I calculated." "Who is she?" "A mistake I made in 1847, Chaol said. "I created her to ease my loneliness. She decided she preferred chaos to companionship." Alara stepped into the snow. It didn't feel cold anymore. Nothing felt cold to her anymore. Her body had become a different instrument, attuned to temperatures that existed only in the space between life and death. "She wants to meet me," Alara said, not a question. "She wants to destroy what you represent," Kyle corrected, "which is the possibility that creatures like us can change, transform, seek redemption rather than simply accept damnation as inheritance." "Can she?" "Yes," he said, very easily. "You're still mostly human. A human that tastes like my blood, yes, but human nonetheless. Your bones haven't calcified into immortal density yet. Your heart still beats because it believes in beating. She could stop any of that." Alara stood in the snow, feeling it melt against the heat of a body that no longer obeyed mortality's rules. She could feel her own transformation now, not as abstract concept, but as present fact. Her teeth were sharper, her vision perceived colors that shouldn't exist. Her hunger, which had nothing to do with food and everything to do with a craving for presence and connection, was becoming its own kind of survival mechanism. "Then we have 3 choices," she said. "I can run, you can kill her, or we can let her teach me what you won't." "Never the third," Kyle said. His voice held finality, the tone of someone who had already experienced every possible outcome of that third choice. "Viviana teaches only destruction, masquerading as freedom." "But I'll meet her," Alara said. It wasn't a question. Kyle's face was a landscape of ancient grief. "Yes," he said finally, "because you're no longer the woman in the dungeon, and pretending you are will only breed resentment. Viviana will return in 3 nights. You'll meet her in the courtyard, I'll observe from the shadows, and you'll learn what it means to have options." And if I choose her? Then I'll know that my attempt at redemption was always just another form of damnation, he said, and I'll finally accomplish what I've been trying to do for 400 years. He didn't need to name what that was. They both understood. Viviana was nothing like Alara had imagined. She was beautiful in the way that beautiful things often aren't beautiful at all, in the way that poison is beautiful, that fire is beautiful, that the moment before violence is a kind of terrible aesthetic. She wore red velvet that might have been blood-rendered fabric, and her smile was a knife that had learned to laugh. "So you're the Redemption Project," Viviana said. She circled Alara the way a predator circles prey, though there was something performative in it, as if she'd watched someone circle prey once and decided it was an adequate way to express contempt. Kyle's latest attempt to prove that monsters can be reborn as something approaching human. "I'm not sure what I am," Alara said. She'd learned over weeks in the castle that honesty was the only currency worth spending. "That's better," Viviana said. "That's almost wise." She stopped circling. In the moonlight, her eyes were the color of old blood, of rust, of all the violence that time had worn smooth. "Do you want to know what he won't tell you? The reason Cale clings to this castle like a hermit, afraid of his own reflection?" Alara said nothing, but her silence was permission. "Because he created me," Viviana continued, "and I killed everyone he loved out of pure artistic ambition. I slaughtered his sister's family in Vienna. I drained the village doctor who'd been his only friend for 50 years. I did these things not because I needed to, but because I wanted to demonstrate that immortality without morality is the most honest form of existence." "And he blames himself," Alara said. She understood this suddenly, fully, with the kind of clarity that came from being remade at cellular level. "He created you, so he's responsible for every death." "Exactly," Viviana smiled. "And he's been trying to apologize to the universe ever since by being pathologically kind to every fragile mortal he encounters. You're not special, little servant. You're just his current act of contrition." The words should have devastated Alara, and part of her felt the weight of them, the possibility that everything Cale had offered was simply guilt transposed into devotion. But another part of her, the part that was becoming something other than human, understood the deeper truth. "You're right," Alara said. "But his guilt doesn't negate his love, and his love doesn't negate his guilt. Both things exist. Both things matter." Viviana's smile sharpened. "You're going to refuse me?" "Yes," Alara said, "but not because I'm afraid of you, and not because Cale has convinced me of his redemption. I'm refusing you because you're offering destruction wrapped in freedom, and I've already had enough destruction." "Then I'll wait," Viviana said. "I'll wait until the hunger consumes you the way it consumes all of us. And when you realize that love is just another cage, you'll remember that I tried to offer you the keys." She left the courtyard, moving faster than things should move, dissolving into the darkness in a way that suggested she'd never been entirely present at all. Cale emerged from the shadows where he'd been waiting. His face was a question and an answer. Terror and relief compressed into the features of someone who'd experienced too much time and too many endings. "You passed," he said. "Did I?" Alara asked. "Or did I simply choose the cage I understood over the chaos I didn't?" "Perhaps they're the same choice," Cale said. "Perhaps all choices are simply preferences for one form of confinement over another. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts." The transformation took place over a night that lasted 7 years. That's how time worked now, Alara understood. Duration was no longer a fixed measurement, but a subjective experience. What felt like hours could contain whole seasons. What might have been decades could compress into a single moment of pure clarity. Kyle stayed with her through it, not as a physician or a lover, but as a witness. She needed a witness more than she needed anything else. The pain was architectural. It built from her bones outward, restructuring every cellular arrangement, rewriting her at the level of pure biology. Her heart stopped beating and then realized it had never needed to beat in the first place. The blood inside her transformed from life-sustaining fluid to something else. A currency, yes, but also a language she could suddenly read. Every drop of blood in her body contained memories that weren't hers. Cale's centuries, Viviana's violence, the accumulated consciousness of every being Cale had ever fed on. She screamed, but the sound was music to her own ears. She wept, but the tears were pearls, precious things, more real than anything she'd been before. When dawn came, she was no longer subject to it. The sunlight that pressed against the castle windows held no threat. It was simply light, and she was simply free from the tyranny of being burned by it. Ilara sat up in the bed. Her reflection in the mirror above the fireplace was almost unchanged. Slightly sharper features, eyes that held depths that hadn't existed before, skin that seemed to contain its own faint luminescence. But the alterations were subtle. She could walk among mortals now. They would look at her and see beauty, yes, but not wrongness. "How do you feel?" Cale asked. He was at the window, watching the dawn with the eyes of someone who'd been grieving it and mourning it for 400 years. "Like I finally understand what I've always been," Ilara said. "I was never meant to be a servant in a household. I was never meant to be anything small. I was meant for this, for hunger and eternity and the strange mercy of never having to die." Kyle turned from the window. His expression was complicated, joy and sorrow intertwined like lovers who can never quite separate. "Viviana will come back now," he said. "She'll know the change has completed. She'll make you an offer." "Let her come," Ilara said. She rose from the bed on limbs that held no weakness, only potential. "I'm not the servant anymore. I'm not even the woman from the dungeon. I'm what comes after both of those things. I'm the choice to endure, the refusal to be destroyed, the insistence that love and damnation can be the same thing." She approached Cale and took his face in her hands. His features, which had seemed so ancient and worn when she'd first met him, now seemed young. Not because he'd changed, but because she'd finally learned how to see. "I choose you," she said. "Not because I have to. Not because I'm afraid of the alternative. But because redemption is the only immortality worth having, and you're the only being I've ever met who understands that." Kyle kissed her then, and it was the kind of kiss that existed outside of time, the kind that contained all the other kisses they would share across the centuries, all the blood they would share, all the nights they would spend learning what it meant to be alive in the space between damnation and grace. 6 months passed, and Ilara had completely forgotten what mortality felt like. The castle had transformed under her touch. She'd opened the sealed chambers, permitted light to flow through corridors that had known only darkness, invited history to coexist with presence. The dungeon where she'd begun was now a library dedicated to the names of Cale's victims, not as punishment, but as memorial. Each name inscribed, each story honored, each death acknowledged as the tragedy it had been. Viviana came regularly, trying her various seductions and terrors, her offers of chaos and freedom. But Ilara had learned the subtle art of refusing without judgment. She understood now that Viviana's cruelty was itself a form of suffering, that her refusal to seek redemption was its own kind of wound, endlessly bleeding. On a night when the stars seemed unusually present, as if the sky itself was drawing closer to bear witness, Ilara and Cale stood on the castle's highest tower. From here, the world spread out like a map of all possible futures. "Do you regret it?" Cale asked. "The choice to transform? The loss of mortality?" Ilara considered the question with the full weight of her transformed consciousness. She thought of the servant she'd been, the woman in the dungeon, the creature she was now, not evil, not good, but something larger than those categories. Something that understood that love was both redemption and damnation. that eternity was both gift and punishment, that the only meaning in immortality was the meaning you created within it. "I regret nothing that brought me here," she said finally. "I'm grateful for the dungeon because it made the castle seem beautiful. I'm grateful for being sold because it meant being found. And I'm grateful for you, not because you saved me, but because you were brave enough to let me save you." Kyle took her hand. His skin was warm now. She realized with a strange clarity that she'd never felt warmth from him before. Love had changed his temperature, altered the fundamental nature of what he was. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what comes next. There's a war brewing in Europe. Empires are being born and murdered. The world is about to be remade. We could retreat further into the castle, pretend immortality insulates us from history." "But we won't," Alara said. "No," Kyle agreed, "we won't. Because redemption isn't about escape. It's about engagement. It's about standing in the fire and refusing to let the world burn alone." They stood together as the night deepened, as stars wheeled overhead in their slow, patient revolution. Somewhere in the distance, thunder spoke in the language of coming change. Somewhere, other immortals were stirring, other servants were being sold, other dungeons were being unlocked. And in the tower of the castle that had become home, Alara understood something she'd never been able to conceive as a mortal, that every ending was a choice, and every choice was a form of eternity. She'd chosen this, the castle, the blood, the strange and terrible beauty of loving something that was supposed to be her predator. She'd chosen to be redeemed, not by being changed, but by changing the one who changed her. The iron key hung from a chain around her neck now, the same key that had opened her dungeon cell. She'd taken it after her transformation, claimed it as a symbol. It was no longer an instrument of captivity. It was proof that doors could open both ways, that those who had been imprisoned could become the liberators, that the servant and the served were only roles we played until we were brave enough to write new scripts. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned. Like if you choose eternity for love that sees your soul. Comment eternal if you'd survive the night for someone worth dying for. 10 years had passed, and the world had learned to call it the Great War. Alara stood in the ruins of what had once been a Vienna hospital, her hands steady as she worked. Around her, the dying and the dead existed in that liminal space where the difference between them became academic. Kale was somewhere in the Eastern Wing, using his centuries of medical knowledge to save lives that mortality still believed were worth saving. She'd taken the name Elena Constantine when they'd left the castle. It was safer that way. Immortals who drew attention rarely lived long enough to regret it. She worked as a nurse, and no one questioned how she never slept, how her hands never shook despite the horrors she witnessed daily, how she could hold a dying soldier's hand and make him believe in those final moments that his death meant something. The war had given her purpose in a way the castle never could. Here, redemption wasn't abstract philosophy. It was blood-stained gauze. It was the weight of another human being choosing to trust you with their final breath. It was the knowledge that she could have chosen Viviana's path and instead chose this. That night, in a temporary quarters that smelled of carbolic and suffering, Kyle found her washing blood from her hands. The water ran red, then pink, then clear. But they both knew the stains went deeper than skin. "The Russians are advancing," he said. "The Austro-Hungarian Empire is collapsing. Within weeks, this hospital will be in a war zone." Alara dried her hands on a cloth that had seen better centuries. "Then we moved to the next hospital, and the one after that." "We could leave," Kyle offered. Not persuasively, but as though he needed to voice the option to prove he'd considered it. "Return to the castle. Wait for the world to finish destroying itself." "No," Alara said. She turned to face him. Even after 10 years, his beauty still contained the shock of wrongness, something about him that made mortals' brains stutter, that made them instinctively understand they were in the presence of something that shouldn't exist. We do this until we can't anymore. Cale's expression shifted. It was subtle, a tightening at the corners of his eyes, a compression of the muscles around his mouth. She'd learned to read these micro-expressions, the way immortals communicated truths too large for words. Viviana has been very busy, he said quietly. She's been creating others, turning soldiers into immortals, giving them hunger and strength and no moral framework to contain it. The war is becoming her hunting ground. Ilara felt the weight of this information settle into her bones. How many? Dozens. Maybe hundreds by now. She's not trying to build an army so much as a religion. She's preaching that we're parasites masquerading as saviors, that redemption is a fairy tale mortals invented to make their predators tolerable. Is she wrong? Ilara asked. Cale considered this with the kind of philosophical honesty that made him dangerous, not to her, but to himself. Partially, he said finally. We are parasites. We do feed on them. The question is whether we can do it with such reverence that the predation becomes something approaching prayer. Ilara moved to the window. Vienna was burning in the distance, not literally, but spiritually. The way cities burn when empires choose violence over negotiation. She could hear the distant thunder of artillery, the screams that distance rendered almost musical. Then we hunt her, Ilara said. We stop her before she creates too many monsters without conscience. That's not possible, Cale said. She's older than my guilt, faster than my penance, and she has nothing to lose because she's never believed she had anything to lose. Then we try anyway, Ilara said. She turned back to him. Because that's what redemption is, not success, but the attempt, not winning, but refusing to let the darkness win unopposed. Kyle moved to her. He took her hands in his. The intimacy of the gesture, hands touching hands, skin against skin, still contained all the charged electricity of that first moment in the dungeon. I've spent 400 years trying to atone for creating her, he said. I've carried that guilt like a stone, and the stone has calcified into something I wear like armor. If we go after Viviana, if we fail, I'll lose the last thing keeping me tethered to this world. You have me, Ilara said. Yes, Kyle agreed. But I'm terrified that won't be enough. Ilara kissed him then, not the way lovers kiss, but the way warriors kiss before battle, the way humans kiss when they know they might be meeting for the last time. It was a kiss that tasted like blood and determination and the strange tenderness that comes from knowing you're both already damned. The hunt took them across Europe for 3 years. They tracked Viviana through Prague and Budapest, through Berlin and Paris, through the ruins of civilizations that had learned that empires were temporary, but hunger was eternal. Each city yielded clues, each trail of bodies led to the next location. Each confrontation pushed them closer to understanding that immortality wasn't about living forever. It was about deciding what you were willing to die for. In Berlin, they found Viviana in the basement of a burned-out theater, surrounded by 13 newly turned immortals. She was feeding them ideology along with blood, teaching them that morality was a cage, that redemption was a weakness, that the only authentic immortal existence was one built on absolute refusal to care. You came, Viviana said. She was beautiful and terrible, corrupt and radiant, everything Cale had feared he'd created. I wondered if you would. We're here to stop you, Cale said. He wasn't angry. Anger was too simple an emotion for what was happening. You can't, Viviana smiled. Because every immortal you destroy, every monster you prevent from being created, is just another ghost added to your collection of guilt. You'll never catch me because catching me means accepting that you've failed, that 400 years of penance hasn't redeemed you at all. Ilara stepped forward. She'd learned, over the decades of her transformation, that sometimes the only response to truth was to weaponize it. She's right, Ilara said. Kyle will never catch you, so I will. What followed wasn't a battle in any traditional sense. It was a conversation that existed in blood and movement, a negotiation conducted in the language of predator and predator. Elara had been Kyle's student for 10 years, but she'd also been watching Viviana, learning her patterns, understanding the particular kind of cruelty that came from absolute freedom. In the end, Elara didn't kill her. Instead, she did something far more devastating. She showed Viviana the mirror, forced her to confront the specific nature of her own damnation. And in that moment of clarity, Viviana, who'd spent centuries running from herself, finally stopped running. She walked into the dawn, not as suicide, but as acknowledgement. She burned in the sunlight like all immortals burn when they finally accept that they deserve to. And in burning, she was finally, irrevocably gone. Elara and Kale returned to the castle in 1923. The war had ended. The world had reorganized itself into new shapes that would spawn new conflicts, new sufferings, new opportunities for monsters to emerge and demand to be fed. But for now, there was silence. There was the possibility of rest. The dungeon had been sealed since they left it. Elara opened it on their first night back, descending into that space where she'd begged for death and found something far more complex instead. The iron key hung from her neck still. She placed it in the center of the stone floor, at the point where she'd knelt all those years ago. "What are you doing?" Kyle asked from the doorway. "Leaving it for the next person," Elara said. "Someday, someone else will be sold to this dungeon. Someone will be desperate enough to accept salvation from a monster. And when they are, they need to know that redemption is possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible." She turned to face him. They were both immortal now, both carrying centuries ahead of them, both marked by the specific knowledge that came from choosing love over chaos. "How long will we do this?" Kyle asked. "How many more wars will we witness? How many more people will we save before the weight of it all becomes too much?" Elara considered the question. It was fair. It was the question she'd been afraid to ask herself for a decade. "Until we can't," she said finally. "And maybe after that too. Because that's what love means when you have eternity to spend on it. Not a feeling that eventually fades, but a commitment that gets deeper and more complex with each passing year." Kale took her hand. They stood in the dungeon together, in the space where servitude had become transcendence, where captivity had become choice. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "The transformation, the loss of your mortality, the knowledge that you'll watch everyone you love die while you continue?" Elara thought of the servant she'd been, broken, invisible, sold for a price that didn't matter, because she'd never had value in the first place. She thought of the woman in the dungeon, begging for death because life had been too much weight to carry alone. She thought of the creature she'd become, not redeemed, not evil, but something that contained both states simultaneously. "I regret nothing that brought me here," she said. It was the same answer she'd given 10 years ago, but it had deepened, accumulated weight, become truth rather than philosophy. "I'm grateful for being broken, because it made the castle seem beautiful. I'm grateful for being sold because it meant being found. I'm grateful for you, not despite your monstrosity, but because of it. Because your monstrosity matched my pain, and together we made something that resembles redemption." They left the dungeon then, sealing it behind them. But not forever. Seals were temporary things, and the castle had a way of revealing what needed to be revealed when the time came. In the years that followed, Elara and Kale became legend, whispered about in the underground networks where immortals traded information, feared by those who preached that monsters should remain monstrous, loved by those who believed that even the damned deserved the chance to become something better. They never left Europe. They moved between cities as mortals moved between rooms, always arriving at moments of crisis, always finding people who needed saving and monsters who needed stopping. They fed, yes, the hunger never disappeared, never became manageable, only became something they learned to metabolize into purpose. And in the spaces between violence, in the quiet moments when they returned to the castle and stood together watching the night sky, Elara would touch the iron key that hung from her neck and remember a simple truth. Every immortal was once someone who chose not to die, and every person offered a choice between damnation and transcendence, chose based on whether they could imagine a future worth surviving for. Chaol had offered her that future. She'd accepted it not because he was good, he wasn't, not entirely, but because his specific form of monstrosity had aligned with her specific form of suffering, and together they'd created something that the world had no name for. Not redemption, exactly, not love, precisely, but something that contained both states, that existed in the space between light and shadow, that proved, every single night, across every single year, that mercy was the only immortality worth having. The castle stood unchanged, as castles do, but inside it, everything had transformed. The dungeon held memories instead of prisoners. The library held names instead of stories. And in the highest tower, two immortals stood together and watched the world burn and rebuild itself, again and again, knowing that somewhere in that cycle, someone else was being offered a choice, and that somewhere, somehow, redemption was still possible, even for monsters. Especially for monsters,